Well, good morning, everyone. Good morning here in the United States. I know a lot of you are joining us from all over the world, so good afternoon and evening for wherever you are. Hello, and thank you for joining us for this World Council of Credit Unions webinar, Fostering True Inclusion for Maximum Impact. My name is Greg Newman, Director of Communications for World Council. Here at World Council, we are committed to promoting diversity, equity, and inclusion in credit unions across the globe. That's why we are thrilled to have Tracie Daniels, President at Synergy Consulting, and the 2021 World Credit Union Conference's top-rated speaker with us today to lead this impactful workshop on inclusion. The session will provide an in-depth understanding of the behaviors that define true inclusion. In examining pseudo-inclusion concepts such as assimilation and differentiation, participants will understand how to separate true inclusion from other behaviors. Tracie will also explore behaviors that foster exclusion. By comparing and contrasting these concepts, participants will develop a greater awareness of what it truly means to act inclusively. Today's session will be highly interactive, so be sure to pop comments and questions for Tracie into the chat. We're also going to have a breakout session later on so you can discuss all of this with your international colleagues. And finally, we are awarding CPE credits for today's session. So if you're looking to collect those CPE credits, be sure to answer the poll questions that will pop up throughout this webinar. With that, I'll pass it over to Tracie. Tracie, thanks for being here.
Thank you so much, Greg, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good day to everybody across the globe. I'm so excited to be here with you talking about this incredibly impactful topic. Now, notice the topic is fostering true inclusion. And in our work with organizations, we come across organizations who really have an intent to foster and build an inclusive workplace, but a lot of that gets clouded through biases, through organizational norms that are hard to disrupt, right? And so what I want to talk about and move forward is the idea around true inclusion. So I will be leveraging some research from a number of people to help inform the way we look at inclusion. And hopefully you'll learn a little bit more about yourself and each others that you can take back to your organization to really start fostering true inclusion. So thank you everybody for tuning in and joining, and I hope that you will work to be interactive. I'd love to hear your comments, your questions, all those good things. We have some polls set up so that you can engage with us in that way as well. So let's just get right into the presentation. Let's first cover our objectives for today. Greg touched on them a little, but I'm just going to expound on them a bit. And in the chat, we're going to post the participant workbook so you can follow along with us as we go through this presentation today. So first is the idea around examining your own inclusive behaviors. As sort of a pre-work to this course, you should have been provided with an inclusive behavioral questionnaire. That is a growth and development tool used just for you to really measure your growth of demonstrating inclusive behaviors over time. And so again, continue to use that resource as a growth and development tool. And I would love to hear your reactions to the assessment when we get to the Q&A for those of you that have completed it. We want to understand the difference between true inclusion and the other three things that may look like inclusion: assimilation, differentiation, and exclusion. And finally, we want to understand how a focus on belongingness and uniqueness can lead to a stronger awareness of true inclusion within your teams and overall within your organizations. So first, let's just kind of break open and talk about what inclusion is. And there's no true definition. So that's number one. But how we think about it can vary. So first, it's really fostering an environment where individuals are fully engaged, valued, supported, and they're driven to reach their full potential. So inclusion is best defined by the individual. And you'll hear me say that over and over again. So an organization can't impose definitions of inclusion that they want employees to really live by, adapt. These are not behaviors that an organization can impose on employees. In fact, it's the opposite. It's where the body of employees can inform the organization as to the best definition of inclusion. So it may look like the level of engagement that a person feels within the organization. It may look like to what degree a person feels valued within the organization, and even not even within the organization per se, but within their teams. The extent or degree to which a person feels supported in the workplace. And that is, that could speak volumes for a lot of people. Support could look very differently from person to person. The extent to which a person feels that they can contribute within an organization, and more than that, that their contributions are received and accepted, right? So it's really about the two-way contribution. And lastly, again, a person feels included when they feel that the organization promotes them and provides the opportunities and access necessary for them to reach their full potential. Okay, and so now that brings us to our first poll, because I want to hear from each of you what inclusion looks like and how do you best define inclusion. So is it through engagement, your engagement within the organization? Is it through feeling valued? Is it through feeling like you are supported? Is it feeling like your contributions matter? And lastly, is it feeling like I can reach my full potential? Great, yeah, love that. Okay. And even though some of you may be challenged with trying to pick just one, I understand you can define inclusion in a number of ways, but we're looking for your primary here. Okay, so I think the poll is done. Okay, so it looks like we are leaning more towards feeling like your contributions matter. That is so important, because you come to work every day and you spend most of your time at work. So you want to feel like the work that you do, the fruits of your labor matter, right? And so that's how you show up. All of that is a byproduct of how you show up. And so you want your organization to recognize that those things are important to you. And so what I've always said and thought of, wholeheartedly, is that employees define inclusion for the organization. It's not defined by the organization. Every employee, again, has a different perspective on how inclusion is demonstrated. Even within those categories I spoke about, engagement can look differently from person to person. So what may look like engagement to me may look different for you. So it's not just important that you talk about engagement, but also what that engagement looks like. Is that, making available every resource to me so that I can feel engaged? Is that satisfaction? Does it feel like I'm being heard? All of those things could define engagement. So as a result, it's best to listen to each employee. And so how do we do that? There's a number of ways we can gather that information. We can gather it through surveys, we can gather it through focus groups, we can gather it through really having intentional conversations with each other. And if there are any leaders in the room, you stand at the front really in shepherding and really shaping how inclusion is promoted within the organization. based on these conversations that you're having with your employees. Now, this video best captures my point in terms of the difference in inclusion from person to person. And I tell you, I've searched high and low for a video, and I found this one, which is great. And I haven't found one like it since. And so I applaud the people at CIPD. They've done a fantastic job on this video. So we're going to watch it now. We're going to talk about how individual definition of inclusion is the most powerful way to promote inclusion within your workplace. So here we go.
For me, an inclusive workplace is where you're allowed to come with your real self, where you are trusted, where you're allowed to flourish and grow.
It's a place where being different doesn't make a difference.
Being able to be an individual, to be yourself, irrespective of race, religion, sexuality, dress sense, style, character.
Where everyone is encouraged to bring their whole selves to work. They feel part of the community.
Where people are willing to explore the difference. No matter how you think or wish to express yourself, it's welcome.
To have people talk to you in the same way you see everyone else talking to each other.
In my view, inclusion is all about recognising individuals for their individual identity. As an LGBT man, I think it's really important that organisations encourage LGBT people to share their views and opinions and to feel protected in the workplace.
I think it's really about everybody having a voice, feeling as being part of a community and that nobody's ever left out.
Have ourselves, our whole beings, our quirky ideas, our funny laughs, our singing, which is usually me, into the workplace, and know that no one's going to look at you weirdly.
Regardless of the level they operate at, everyone having the opportunity to contribute to the organisation.
If you have a disability, flexibility is required. That's given freely. The tools are given freely to enable you to make that contribution and to add that value to your business.
If you could give me your initial reaction to the video and what you saw, what resonated with you the most in terms of what individuals spoke about in the video? What resonated with you the most? So feel free to put your responses in the chat. So I'm going to pull the chat up. Yeah. Fostering, being accepted, everyone having a differing perspective, being able to turn up to work as yourself. Yes. Everyone wanting to be heard. Inclusion was feeling safe to be yourself. We're going to talk about psychological safety as it relates to inclusion. So thank you, Marilyn, for talking about safety. Everyone has a voice, feeling safe. Again, thank you. Being able to be your one true self and being accepted. Every individual can give a potential point of view. Okay, being comfortable in your working environment. Respect as a human being, feeling you matter. Oh, awesome. Way to close that out, Jim. You matter. Thank you. Being able to be accepted in despite of age, gender, disability, treatment. Wonderful, wonderful. And so you see how there are so many different variations and definitions and demonstrations of what it means to be inclusive. And so again, as stewards of the organization, whether we're coworkers or leaders, it is incumbent upon us to understand from each other what inclusion means. Then we can begin to foster an environment that promotes that for everyone. So let's talk a little bit about what research has said about inclusion. This is going to be a little heavy, so I'm going to try and talk high level about it because I am going to talk about some research theory. So inclusion is defined through optimal distinctiveness theory in this approach that we're going to be talking about today. And this is driven from the work of Lynn Shore, who is a professor at San Diego State University, and her and a group of colleagues in the Department of Management did a research study in 2011 on inclusion within work groups. And what we know from this research is that inclusion is best defined within teams and within work groups. So if we know that, then we look to the work groups and the teams for true strategies around inclusion. We also know that teams and groups make up an entire organization, right? So if we're looking at different teams and the inclusion factor within the teams throughout the organization, that helps us build our strategy for inclusion within the organization. So in this particular study, Shore and her researchers used optimal distinctiveness theory, or ODT, to overlay and understand what inclusion looks like in teams. So we'll talk a little bit about optimal distinctiveness theory. And it suggests that inclusion is a balance that one experiences between the need for validation, i.e. similarity to others, which is also catched as belonging. So belonging in the terms of feeling a sense of community, feeling a sense of social connectedness, feeling a sense of similarity. So that's the one need, the need to belong, but that's balanced with the need to be unique, right? I don't want to sort of fade into the group just because I belong. I also want to be acknowledged and seen for my individual contributions, my individual uniqueness that I can bring to the team. And I noticed at the beginning when we did that poll on inclusion, more of us lean towards our contributions, what we can individually contribute to the team as defining inclusion. So we're really looking at our uniqueness and what we bring to the team. But optimal distinctiveness theory says that a person strives for true inclusion when both of those needs are met. The need for belonging, right? That social connectedness, that need for similarity, and that sometimes is best demonstrated through social categories that people identify with, gender, race, and other salient social categories. And the other side is the need for individualization or uniqueness. And so employees, right, they have a choice, right, to opt in or opt out when their needs for belonging and or uniqueness are not being met within this team environment. Okay, and so what the researchers did was look at inclusion through this ODT lens. So what we're looking for is the true definition of inclusion means an environment where individuals feel their sense of belonging and their sense of uniqueness. Okay, so that's what this whole research is all about. And if you're interested in learning more about the study, it's a fantastic study. We can provide that. We can provide a link to the study later on in the session or post session. One of the things that I want to sort of pull out here when we're talking about the need for belonging or the need for social connectedness, the need for similarity, is sometimes if people in a group are too similar, then the group can perceive them as interchangeable, right? And that could result in not really feeling like your full self, not really feeling like you belong. So that's where the need for uniqueness comes in, okay? So as part of the research, what are we looking at? Where do we land with examining inclusion through this ODT lens? Well, we landed where there are 4 distinct categories. when you apply ODT to inclusion. Again, both sides are looking at belongingness and uniqueness. So that's what we're measuring. Okay. Exclusion is pretty easy to identify. So that's what we're going to start with there. That means an individual, there is no connection. There's no sense of similarity to this group, right? There's no sense of social connectedness for social categories. So i.e. no sense of belongingness. So one may feel like an outsider. Uniqueness is not valued either. So I don't feel connected to the group for a sense of similarity, and I don't feel like my unique contributions are valued or even wanted. So that is an exclusion. That's pretty, I'm not going to say easy, but easier than the others to define, observe, experience. And I think we've all been at a place, I don't want to speak for all 143 of you, but I think we've all been at a place and time in our lives where we felt excluded. And it's not a good feeling, but it is part of this model. So we wanted to address it. So for this model, exclusion is defined as low belongingness and low uniqueness, right? And then we move to differentiation. Okay, and this is what I like to call pseudo inclusion. So these are things that may look and feel like inclusion, but they're not true inclusion. So with differentiation, an individual's uniqueness is highly valued, but that's the only thing that's valued in them. And that's what makes them part of the group. That's what makes the group want to pull them in, is their uniqueness. On the other hand, there is a low sense of belongingness. There is, low social connectedness, low similarity. And so what this might look like is being one of a few or the only one that identifies with the social characteristic in this group. And so you may be a marketing expert and therefore you are valued by your marketing, but what you bring in terms of your sense of community and your sense of perspective from your social categories are not welcomed. So you're only welcome for that uniqueness that you bring. And again, maybe it's your expertise in marketing, maybe it's your expertise in IT. And so that's what we call differentiation. And so another example of differentiation may be, and this is the example I use a lot. So we have, let's just say, an Asian American reporter that works for a large newsroom, but only gets stories where it requires, but only works on the Asian American stories or only works on the Asian American profiles. It's fine for you to work on those things, but it's also important for that person to be looked at in other areas, right? So that may be, and that's an example of differentiation where there's no sense of connectedness or belongingness, but they're valued for their uniqueness, their individuality. So again, it may feel like inclusion, but it's not, it's differentiation. Assimilation. Now, I know most of you have probably heard this term before, maybe not in this way, but you've heard the term assimilate, which means to adapt to, lose part of yourself in, right? Something bigger, right? So assimilation is another pseudo-inclusion concept. It may look like inclusion on the surface, but it's not. So in this case, there's high belongingness. So there's high social connectivity, right? So there's not a I'm the only one syndrome. There's a number of people in this group that I connect with based on similarity. And that's with any social category, right? And that feels the need for belongingness. So I feel like I belong, but my uniqueness is washed away. It's downplayed. And you are forced to conform to whatever the status quo is. So that could be an organizational norm. This is the way we've always done it, right? This is the way it's done here. Whatever you did at the old organization, not really relevant for what we're trying to do here. So your uniqueness and what you bring by maybe working for a much larger organization and coming to a small organization is not valued, right? Even though there's a sense of connectedness and belonging within the group from a social category perspective. So that's assimilation. Again, it might look like inclusion, but it's not true inclusion. So one example that the research cites for this is a study done by Eli in 1995, and they found that women attorneys, when trying to break into the legal profession, found themselves forced to dress like, act like, develop a persona that was more indicative of a male hetero approach, because during that time, more often than not, attorneys were identified as males. So again, there's a connectedness in terms of social category. We're all attorneys, we all have studied the law, et cetera. We all work for the same organization. But my uniqueness, in this case, as a female, was not valued because I'm asked to assimilate into this culture that was already built and wanted and wants to continue to thrive. And so again, may feel like inclusion, but it's not, it's assimilation. So I can't bring my full self in because I have to change parts of myself or adapt parts of myself to fit into this mold that's been created. Okay, so that's assimilation. Lastly, inclusion, right? And so this is where we want to strive for, right? So again, both needs are met. So individuals feel socially connected, whatever category that makes them feel a sense of belonging, and only they know that, right? Only is this unique to the individual. And their uniqueness is highly valued. So as we said before, I feel engaged. I feel like I can bring my entire self to work and not be asked to change parts or downplay parts of who I am because of a certain organizational culture. All right, if you notice, the language has changed around our culture. It used to be years ago, particularly when we were recruiting, it used to be we're looking for a good fit for the organization. You all remember that we're looking for somebody to really fit well in this team or fit into our culture. That language is long gone, right? Or at least it should be. So if you're still using organizational fit, let's just kind of move that out the way. That breeds assimilation. Okay, that breeds assimilation. What we want to do is look for cultural add. Look for people who will add to our culture. Look for people who will bring something different into our culture, something that didn't exist before, and recognize that, accept that, respect that, and look for that, right? So when we start talking about inclusion and uniqueness, that's where we get that cultural add. And so when we start building a culture of true inclusion, we find that the status quo is no longer a thing, right? The status quo is no longer a thing. And so now we're going to queue up poll 2, because I know I covered a lot. And we're going to get ready to go into our breakout. So I want to know, as we've talked about exclusion, assimilation, and differentiation, which of these have you experienced at work? Yeah, thank you all for participating. Listen, 56% assimilation. That's real. It's real. So okay, so what does that mean, Tracie, right? What does that mean? That just means The more honest we can be about what our current state is, the better able we're to define what our future state can look like. And when we work with clients, that's what we focus on. It's okay wherever you are on the spectrum, right? It's okay as long as we're being honest about where we are. And so then we can start moving towards growth, development, and progress once we are very honest about where we are. And so it's not uncommon that a lot of you have experienced assimilation. Again, for the reasons I brought up before, that was kind of baked into the recruiting process, and it's baked into our language, baked into our social psyche, as I'll call it. We're always looking for the best fit. We're always looking for the best fit instead of someone who could bring something different, something that we never thought of, something additive, right? So it's nothing more powerful than sharing your experiences. And so that's what we're going to do in this breakout. So I believe Cassie is going to queue up the breakout rooms, and we're going to spend about 15 minutes in a breakout. You should have the workbook that came along with it. I believe they posted in the chat. So you'll have the definitions of these components. And I'd love for you in your groups to share stories, talk through these concepts, assimilation, differentiation, what it looks like in your organization. And then we'll come back together and gather some feedback. But enjoy your time sharing with your group mates. Okay, I see we have some folks coming back after the breakouts. Excellent. Hopefully we had rich conversations. I would love to hear what we talked about in the chat. So if it doesn't matter how many people from the same group, I just want to know how the conversations went around exclusion, differentiation, and assimilation. And if maybe you all met somebody that had the same experience that you did, and what that story meant to you. So feel free to, in the chat, provide some insight so that we can all learn from each other. Wonderful. Embrace your own ad. Here we go. Yeah. Seeing similarities more on the statement of hiring for fit and the importance of alignment on purpose. Yeah. Assimilation, difference being the right fit versus, yeah. I love that, Michelle. Wow, transitioning through the belonging and uniqueness stage as your roles change and as you grow within the organization. Love that. Okay, we need the workbook reposted if possible. Not a lot of people had access to that. Very great. It depends on who we're talking about as the other folks, right? That's really the question. Those other folks that don't get it, and looking at what you can do with your power and position within the organization to change that narrative. Exclusion is still felt and leadership can break. Thank you, Michelle. Yeah, I mean, if you are a leader in the organization, you have a very important responsibility to this, right? Yes, as employees, we have responsibilities, but as I like to say, leaders, they're responsible for the temperature, right? They're responsible for making sure that they are demonstrating inclusive behaviors so as to promote and model what you want your employees to model. Certainly, thank you, Lena. It continues to be a work in progress, and I want everybody to really get that. You never reach a point in this work when you say, we've arrived. If somebody is telling you that you have, they're not telling you the truth. It is a constant journey because organizational culture is always changing. People are coming within your culture, moving out of your culture, and your culture is changing. So there's never a point where you say, we've arrived. And that's the beautiful part, because the journey is what makes it so great, right? the journey is what makes it so great. Exclusion may not be intentional. Potentially, yeah. Potentially, just like implicit bias doesn't operate off intent, right? But it's very alive and well. Technology can be a barrier. Thank you, Antonio. Yes. And then we look at, right, how do we work through those barriers in light of them, right? How do we work through them? Sounds like some great conversations. Thank you, Michelle. We're constantly evolving. We're constantly evolving. And it starts with us. And I think I've said that before. It has to start with us. If we're not willing to change, we can't expect our organizations to change. So we can only be responsible for our change, right? And so we work within ourselves. And that's what that inclusive behavior assessment is also helpful to. Where do you sit with how you show up? Are you demonstrating inclusive behaviors, right? How do you show up at work? You can only answer part of that. Let me just be very clear. You can only answer part of that question, how you show up at work. You can only answer part of that. The other people that interact with you is going to have to answer, give you the other side of that. That's what's called your blind spots, right? Call your blind spots. So taking in the information that you know about yourself and what others experience from you, that's growth. Okay, that's growth. So great conversations. Thank you so much for sharing. And I'm trying not to deviate too much from my presentation, but I love talking about this stuff. I'm sure you can see that. So let's go back and take a look at what research is saying about team inclusion and how we can learn a bit from research. So thank you everybody for sharing. Thank you for being in your groups and sharing your stories. What does research say about team inclusion? So this research is based off of research conducted by Cornell University. And as I said, they feel that, or they've concluded that inclusion is most prominent and most demonstrated in teams, in work groups, right? So what does true team inclusion look like? Individuals experience high levels of psychological safety, engagement, satisfaction, and commitment. So let's talk a little bit about psychological safety and what that looks like. I know you all have heard of the term psychological safety, and that's exactly what you're thinking. Safe? Wow, God, do I have to feel safe in my work? Absolutely. Psychological safety, not physical safety. Psychological safety speaks to the environment where employees feel comfortable providing input. They feel like they can make mistakes without fear of retribution or retaliation or blame, because mistakes is how you learn, right? Mistakes are how you learn. And there's high trust. And let me tell you something, after doing, training over 1,000 leaders, it's very difficult to establish trust and to keep it, right? So as, leaders in organizations and as employees in organizations, you are continuing to foster an environment of trust. And all of those components add into psychological safety. Groups experience fewer in-group versus out-group conflicts, okay, when you look at true inclusion within teams. And finally, status differences are minimized within the group such that it doesn't necessarily matter, where the ideas are coming from. The ideas don't always have to come from the top, right? The ideas can come from anywhere, and recognizing that, appreciating that, change can come from anywhere. And so again, your status of the organization is minimized within the group because we're all working together towards the same goal. Okay. All right. Okay. And individual members experience stronger group identification. You become connected. That's that sense of belonging we were talking about earlier. Stronger group identification, stronger ties to the group. All right, so what does it look like? How is it demonstrated in a group? right? So you're going to check these against the behaviors of your particular teams. Number one, employees of this group or team feel valued as people, for people and everything that they bring, not just the jobs that they fill, okay? As a group and group members, we want to listen for understanding and not for critique. So inclusive teams build strong norms around listening for understanding, as opposed to listen to critique or listen to, throw around ideas. Throwing around ideas is fine as long as we're listening to understand perspective. Understanding different perspectives, right? So teams can feel free to ask each other what they think, what they feel, what are we missing? What would you do differently? Things like that, questions like that. Diversity in roles, rank, and function improves problem solving. So looking at various levels, and because depending on where you sit in the organization, you may take a different view or have a different perspective. And inclusive teams look at every perspective to make very conscientious decisions. So again, not all answers have to come from the top. It can be a variety of spaces within the organization where perspective can be acknowledged and received. Recognize the value of diverse influence. And here we're talking more about members, what they bring, their whole self, their identities, their backgrounds, their experiences, and how they form their contributions to the team. We don't all want to think alike. We want to promote individual, new, and innovative thinking. And working through that, we want to create authentic discussions. And by authentic, I mean true, where people can tell their story, again, without fear of criticism or judgment, but we're seeking to understand and accept. Understand and accept and acknowledge what others have been through, what others' life experiences are, their past that got them to where they are now on this team. Openly address disagreements. Now, this is one that most people find a little, I don't know why this would be in there, but fantastic things come out of conflict. So inclusive teams do not shy away from conflict. It is expected that there will be some disagreement, some different ways of viewing the same thing. But the idea around cultural competence is that we look through and understand those differences in an attempt to understand ourselves better. So conflict is good. It's good. It breeds, or it should breed, understanding, awareness, acknowledgement, something that maybe we haven't considered before. So we want to openly, where did we go wrong? What's happening? If you have disagreements within, say, two team members, what is the nature of the disagreement and how is that contributing to the impediment of our team progress? How can we hold each other accountable, right? How can we make sure that each of us are doing what we said we would do as it relates to team performance? So we want to openly address and resolve them together. Okay, so the last poll we have, I'm going to go back, is poll 3. So I want to know what your team's current state of inclusion is. And it's okay if you don't know for sure, just take a guess. So are we at the point that we haven't really started down that path to inclusion? Maybe some of us have started, but we're at the very beginning. Maybe some of us have implemented inclusive team behaviors and feel good about where we are, but know we have some room to grow. Maybe some of our teams are at a point where they are understanding and demonstrating inclusive behaviors and understand the path forward. And then they're looking at creating more norms around how we bring new people into the group, because again, your culture is going to continue to change. So how would you describe your team's current state of inclusion? and know that wherever you are on that spectrum is good. It is wherever you are on that spectrum is good. Because like I said, in order to really be honest, or in order to really be strategic about where you want to go, you have to be honest about where you are. Okay, a lot of startup, and that's great. Okay, startup at the beginning, 45%, closely followed by implementing inclusive team behavior. So hopefully what you walk away with today is a better understanding, or or more behaviors to add to the table. If you're at not started, hopefully this provides somewhat of a blueprint for where to start or how to start. If you're at the beginning, again, remember, you have to be honest about where you are in order to figure out and be strategic about where you want to be. So everybody is at a solid point. No matter where you are, you're at a solid point. Because as I said, this is a continual learning opportunity, and we're continuing to grow and always developing in this area. So with that, that brings me to the conclusion of this part, and I believe we're going to take questions. So Greg, are we going to facilitate the Q&A or?
Yeah, thanks so much, Tracie. I mean, I think I learned a lot on this. I think a lot of people did. One of the questions that someone asked, Caroline asks, would you say that differentiation can lead to feelings of being the token?
Absolutely. That's where it's stemming from, right? And because there is this sense of, there's no sense of belonging or no connectedness. And there's been research that talks about the token, the person that's always looked at to speak for the majority of whatever population they represent. So yes, differentiation absolutely leads to tokenism, which is a real thing. Yes, it is a true concept.
I'm always curious, you mentioned that it's good to have conflict in teams, and I agree with you, but I do think, sometimes what I notice is that, introverts can feel excluded because they're not prone to go forward and engage in those conflicts. They'd rather sit back, or sometimes the people who really are comfortable with conflict tend to dominate conversations and get their ideas out there ahead of time. So is that another facet, I guess, of enhancing inclusion and exclusion, I guess, and getting rid of exclusion, because that's a part I see a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and we see that often too. The same people are making the decisions in the team. The same people are always the first to speak in meetings. The same people are always those people coming up with ideas. So some of the strategies that you can employ is, having multimodal approaches to receiving feedback, such that your introverts who may not be comfortable providing their suggestions in an open forum can provide via email, or can provide in a one-on-one, and then bring those to the table. So that can be an opportunity for those who otherwise would prefer not to be as engaged, to find another way in. And doesn't necessarily mean that they're not engaged because they don't weigh in on the conversation. They could be very much observing, processing, thinking about things, and then maybe later provide some insight. But to your point, it could be overshadowed by people that, again, speak all the time, always come up with the ideas. So how can we think differently about that? Have someone different speak. Have someone rotate the meeting leadership. Have multiple people leading the conversation, multiple people coming up with the generation of ideas. So you want to spread that around.
Are there certain industries, I come to the credit union space from the news industry. I heard you reference earlier an example you mentioned about an Asian American reporter, and I find that leadership in this industry is so much better and so much more inclusive and so much less top down than it is in the news business. So are there, the financial institution or financial services industry, where do you compare that to other industries in terms of how much work there is left to do? Is that a really difficult question, or?
That's a question I can't answer. Do you know why? Because I don't like to benchmark diversity. Because every organization, even if it's within an industry, is unique in and of itself. So what strategies may work for one may not work for others. Certainly structure plays a role, which I think is where you're getting at. The structure of an organization plays a role. How well defined or how top heavy leadership plays a role in terms of being able to promote inclusion within the organization. But I don't know that we're at a point where we can say one organization is, primed for having a better inclusive environment, because you could have one that has a great top-down approach, but still exercises exclusion because of bias. So bias is always present. So it's how do we work within these structures? How do we look at our policies and practices? How do we look at our norms? Those are the things that we kind of focus on to build out and reshape to promote inclusion within the organization.
Got a great question here, I think, from Faith, who asks, what is the best way to engage coworkers who do not like DEI programs or understand their purpose?
Oh, geez, that's loaded, Faith. So the best way to engage coworkers is have a candid conversation about change. Start with change. That's number one, because at the end of the day, DEI, strategic planning, human capital management, all of it involves some type of change. And so it's really seeking to understand that person's story. So first start with their thoughts on change, because all of this is going to require change to some level. And some people are just inherently resistant to change because it's very comfortable in the space that we're in. And so, changing can be risky. Changing can invoke a lot of anxiety. And so maybe their reasons have very little to do with DEI, but more to do with how they respond to change in general. So understanding their story, but starting with their philosophy around change would be one way to kind of, I don't want to say break the ice, but maybe kind of start the conversation.
Do you find that any of that is generational? Are young people more willing to listen to these conversations?
So there's a lot of research that suggests that, and that's simply and I don't want to simplify it. There's research that suggests because millennials are the most diverse, and now even centennials, millennials aren't even any longer the most diverse. Now the centennials are the most diverse generation, then that lends well to representation, right? And so when you think of generations that may be different, you're looking at what the representation was like at the time, what the acceptance was at the time, what the norms were at the time, how organizations were structured at the time. So yes, there's definitely some validity to that, but it doesn't mean that people can't change, and it doesn't mean that people can't see the reason and need for change, even if they're Generation X or Y or the baby boomer generation.
I don't see any more questions in the chat. Tracie, did you have any final thoughts that you wanted to impart today?
No, I think it was just great. I hope that what we talked about today, you will take back to your teams and engage with each other. If you walk away with nothing else, I want you to walk away with 2 things that you're going to do differently. I always like to give homework. It's not homework. Just think of it as something, a growth opportunity. What will you do differently to promote inclusion? Does need coming up with inclusion? If so, what are the keys? No, you don't have to. If what you're asking, Abduli, is that you need to come up with an inclusion strategy, no, I just want you to think about 2 things that you will do differently to promote inclusion within your workplace. And that is, looking at how you show up. You can point to your inclusive behavioral assessment for some ideas. But every bit of growth is progress. So we want to focus on that.
Thought-provoking session. Tracie, thanks again. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Before we go, just a quick reminder that registration is open for the 2022 World Credit Union Conference in Glasgow, Scotland this summer, July 17th to the 20th. And you may have heard me mention Tracie was our top-rated speaker of the 2021 virtual conference. And so we're excited for her to be joining us in person this year in Scotland. So make sure you sign up and participate in another of Tracie's amazing sessions there. And you can get a link to the World Credit Union Conference for registration. It's in the chat. You'll see it at wcuc.org. And if you want to hear an interview with one of the keynote speakers who's going to be featured in Glasgow this July, you can listen to the latest episode of the Global Credit Union podcast. I spoke with Belinda Parmar. She is the CEO and president of the Empathy Business, and she is going to be speaking, or she does speak with me on the Global Credit Union podcast. I'm just going to pop that link into the chat for anyone who would like to listen to that and hear more about what else is going to be coming up at the World Credit Union Conference in July. So once again, today's webinar was recorded. I know a lot of you have been asking when it's going to be available. It will be available either later today or tomorrow on the World Council YouTube channel. That's at youtube.com/Woku. Thanks again for joining us, everybody. Have a great rest of your day.